Welcome back to my podcast, Behind the Lens. Today, I am breaking down my Aice Media Studies final project and will be reflecting on the creative process behind it. I will be answering two key questions in this section. One, how does my product engage with its audience and how could it be distributed in the real world as a real media text? And two, how did my production skills develop throughout this project? So first off, talking about how it engages with the audience. Immediately in the first few seconds, I have a hook. So I think it's like 2 or 3 seconds where it's just a black screen at the start, which is not meant to be just trying to pad out the time. That was meant to be a little buffer. It was meant to be a buffer between when you unpause the video and when the text shows up with the spotlight sound effect and all that, because it's supposed for when you unpause a video or a movie, you kind of expect it to immediately start, or for it to immediately start playing. So when there's those few seconds of pause before it actually pops up and starts, maybe you think maybe it's like buffering, maybe it's loading, maybe you didn't unpause it, and then you see the text just pop up in the middle of the screen, just the text, nothing else, with this loud spotlight sound effect. It kind of acts as a hook and grabs your attention immediately as it starts. So when the music starts and when the clips start showing, you're already paying attention. Instead of having to take a little bit to get into it, it just immediately gets the audience hooked right into it. So the audience for this is supposed to be it's targeted towards people who like psychological dramas. Some conventions that I used that apply to this genre are things like a slow burn, where ideas are supposed to be developed over time. So not a lot of stuff in the opener does make sense by itself. It would be a slow burn throughout the film. It would be explained and context would be added on as you watch to make you understand what was being shown. So, something that relates to that is like symbolic mise-en-scene, which is basically what all of my opener was, where what's shown isn't meant to be taken literal. It kind of represents the idea of his emotions and what he's feeling as the film progresses, which would kind of act as a reward later on in the film. So if audiences were, like the hook is supposed to do, make them pay attention in the beginning of the film, they'll remember those scenes. And so when references to those scenes would be made later in the film, or when those scenes would be brought back later in the film to add the context, they would remember and kind of be in the context, would kind of act as a reward for paying attention in that first little bit. In terms of distribution, the main way right now is YouTube, having it uploaded on YouTube. If this were like a more legit project, YouTube would still probably be a good resource, because that is a very good resource for like indie filmmakers who don't have a crazy high budget or able to get it on streaming services. But if this were a project that had a high budget like that, and had the resources and ability, streaming services would definitely be amazing. But for right now, what would be realistic is just YouTube. And for a lot of indie filmmakers, that's the best way to go about distribution. Also things like social media, like Instagram is a great way to advertise it. You obviously not posting the full thing on Instagram, but just posting like little clips, teasers, posters, anything like that to promote the film and try and just get word out about it. Social media is an amazing resource to promote. So now on to my second question. How did my production skills develop throughout this project? So going into this project, I had already worked with cameras a lot before. I was already comfortable with that. One thing that I wish I could have got, or two things I actually wish I could have gotten more experience with this, were lighting and sound. I did have some ideas when it comes to lighting, some extra lighting I wanted to add in, but there were just multiple circumstances, which I talked about in one of my blogs, that ultimately led me to not being able to use the lighting I wanted to, use like the additional lighting I wanted to. So everything in the final film was just the natural lighting with a bit of editing from what it originally was. And the sound also was another thing. That was the main reason why I chose to use just one music track instead of the original sound, because in my original concept, I originally planned to have an actor and everything, but that didn't work out. and then locations I wanted to originally film in didn't work out either. And so with what the final concept came out to be, kind of didn't make sense to use the original audios from the videos anyways, because it would have just been a lot of random cuts, and which wouldn't have sounded good, and just a lot of random noise that just didn't make sense. So I tried to find a music track that somewhat fit what I was going for. And even though I wasn't able to find one that was perfect, I think it fits it well enough to get the idea across. But my production skills did develop when it comes to planning. That was a big thing that is not really shown in this final project because a lot of the stuff was last minute. But going into future projects, I would definitely know that I have to plan a lot more efficiently, a lot more effectively, and a lot more in depth to ensure there's a lot more success rather than failure, and not as many major changes that have to be made to the final product so last minute. Also, just editing with Premiere Pro, there's definitely, every time you use it, there's something new that whether that be a new problem or just a new technique that I learned, that every time I use it and make a full product like this, it definitely helps me get more comfortable using that tool and knowing what to do going into it. So overall, I would say the two main ways that this project helped me develop my production skills would be learning what I would be like taking away that I have to learn how to plan better, and just overall getting more comfortable with editing. And now to my director's commentary portion, where I will be discussing the next two questions, which will be number one, how it represents social groups and issues, along with how it uses and challenges conventions, and number two, how I integrated different technologies throughout the project. So, starting with the conventions, my product uses multiple conventions, like I mentioned before, with the slow burn and the symbolic mise en scene. Basically, these conventions are just very typical of psychological dramas and help to define it as a psychological drama, which is what the audience would come to expect, because it is socially marketed towards people that like psychological dramas. So those are the two main conventions that I use that are typical of the genre. Also, I also challenge some conventions. Like, usually you would see a lot of low-key lighting in psychological dramas to create kind of a bit of suspense, which I do use later in the second half, really, of the opener. But for the first half, it's very bright, which is very opposite. The two halves are very opposite because that's supposed to show his mental change, his emotional change, where it's still the same ideas, the same vibes, but it's just a lot darker. And it's not because he's not supposed to go like crazy or like supposed to be some insane person or anything, but mostly to show that it's a lot more less clear. Like, he's a lot less clear in his head. He can't see things as clearly. They're a lot darker, because he's supposed to be dealing with schizophrenia. So it kind of clouds his mind and stuff like that, which is what it is supposed to show. So that's how I challenge the conventions, because in the first half it's very bright and very opposite of what's expected from this genre, and then it transitions into the normal lighting that and aesthetic and vibe that you would expect from a psychological drama. In terms of representation, it's supposed to represent people with mental issues like schizophrenia. I aim to represent those groups in like a realistic and respectful way. If it were like a full thing and I actually got to show those groups, obviously, avoiding stereotypes at all, because the whole thing is kind of supposed to be like a mental health PSA, kind of, in a way, where it's supposed to show that people with schizophrenia, while their mind might be different than it was before, and they might change them in some ways, they're still supposed to be like the same people. Well, not supposed to be, but they are the same people. And like it's not like they're a completely new person. In some cases they are, but in most cases, the underlying person is still, with their personality, is still there, just in some different ways. So that's also the point of the name, which is Are You There? That's the name of this project, and that's supposed to kind of be taken in multiple ways, where it's everybody else around him is kind of, because he's dealing with schizophrenia, is kind of treating him differently, like he's not there. And so it's kind of supposed to be like they're asking, like, are you still there? Like, are you still you? Stuff like that. And they're kind of isolating him a little, or isolating themselves away from him a little bit more. But also from his end, because he still feels himself and he's still like, I'm still me, I'm still normal. Like, I'm not some crazy person or anything. Just because he has this mental condition, he's not just some crazy person who just isn't himself anymore. So he's also in a way asking them, are you there? Because he's like, why are you guys suddenly so distant? Why are you guys suddenly like leaving me out of stuff a lot? So it can be taken from both perspectives, whichever the audience chooses to, like, personal. It's basically just personal thought, however you want to take it, is basically how that title is supposed to go. So that's how it represents its social groups, which is once again just supposed to be like showing that basically just because people suffer from some mental condition doesn't mean that they're lower or any less than they were before. And now moving on to the technology and how I implemented different technologies and tools to create this final product. So for hardware, I used my Canon 90D and two different lenses depending on the shot that I wanted to record this. Other than that, I did have a few other tools, but I didn't necessarily need them for the shots, so I didn't really use that. So it was mostly just my camera. Other stuff, like for this shot right here, I would use my car, and this shot right here, I also used my car. Just any of the fast moving shots I got by literally just kind of holding my camera to the side while I was driving and just hoping it looked good. And while that's mostly a little more shaky than I would like it, that's just kind of inevitable unless I was using a little bit better stuff to be able to stabilize it. But I don't think that it was, I think it turned out in a way that looks usable. So yeah, so obviously my camera, my car I used as well. Also stuff like my phone, which I'm using to record this right now, and my laptop, which I am reading off of as I use this, which are also going into making the final, because the final project is more than just that little 2-minute opener. It's also this and all the blogs, and everything I use to create everything for this final. For software, I used Adobe Premiere Pro to edit. And so that's just where I put everything together in. And that's mostly it for all the technologies that I used to make this final product. So, in conclusion, that is how my project both follows and challenges media conventions, represents social groups in a way that I would hope in the final product, if it was made into a full thing, would be respectful and realistic, and how it demonstrates how a different range of technologies and tools can all come together and be used to create one cohesive product to be able to put out in the end.